said, I'll. In a 1992 television interview with Nobel Prize-winning Black writer Toni Morrison, journalist Charlie Rose asked Morrison to share her thoughts on Rodney King, a Black man who was brutally assaulted by members of the Los Angeles Police Department the year prior. In the course of this now iconic act of police brutality, the officers viciously beat, kicked, and tased King, who was unarmed. What they did not know is that their vicious attack was being recorded by an amateur videographer whose film of the incident appeared on televisions around the world, igniting international outrage and rebuke. Despite this recording, however, each officer charged was acquitted. Within hours, Black communities in Los Angeles began to riot in order to express their resistance to this gross miscarriage of justice, and more than this, to challenge the historical persistence of those racial practices that have enabled these and other officers to enact such performances of anti-Black violence with impunity. With these events in mind, journalist Charlie Rose turns to Toni Morrison and solicits, quote, her take on Rodney King and Los Angeles and all of that experience. Morrison's response is telling, and I have a quote here for you. The most memorable thing to me about Rodney King, Morrison says, and what happened afterward, was people kept saying, oh, this terrible explosion, oh, the riots, oh, this is awful, and could have been avoided. What struck me most about the people who were burning down shops and stealing was how long they waited. The restraint, not the spontaneity, the restraint. You realize the moment to be anarchic was when we saw those tapes. When we first saw those tapes, they waited for justice. They waited. How long was that? 9 months, a year? They waited for justice almost a year, and it didn't come. No one talks about the fact that no one ran out into the streets as I wanted to, and they didn't do a thing. They waited. That's amazing. That's amazing to me. In this powerful meditation on Rodney King and the LAPD's savage display of human disregard, Morrison puts her finger on the pulse of an important historical connection among Blackness, freedom, and time. As 1991 Black Los Angeles waited for justice that, in Morrison's words, quote, didn't come, they joined their ancestors and Black people across the African diaspora who, at every turn, have been forced to wait for freedom, to wait for justice, to wait for citizenship, as white supremacists work to reinforce the global infrastructure of anti-Blackness. From enslaved Africans who were forced to wait in the belly of the slave ship, to those who were forced to wait on the auction block, from those who were forced to wait for emancipation to those who were inundated by calls during the civil rights movement to go slow, waiting has routinely been weaponized as a tool of anti-Black violence and civic exclusion, one designed to control Black people and ultimately to limit their freedom. I name this violent system of racialized waiting Black patience. By Black patience, I mean a large-scale racial project that demands performances of waiting among Black people as a way to invigorate anti-Blackness and white supremacy. On this front, I think the origins of the word patience itself are instructive, coming from the Latin word patientia, which means suffering, and the Latin verb pati, which means to suffer. The act of patience is at its root a performance of suffering. Further, when we consider this in relation to the violent histories of suffering that have targeted Black life for more than 4 centuries, from slavery to Jim Crowism to lynching and mass incarceration, the racialized history of patience becomes clearer. So in a word, what I'm suggesting here is that Black patience is a violent racial project, one that uses coercive acts of waiting to reinforce the structures of racial power at the heart of our global communities. In the final analysis, Black patience works to delay and to ultimately deny, right? It's not just about the delay, it is the delay as a strategy to ultimately deny Black freedom. They waited for justice, Morrison laments, and it didn't come. In my first book, Black Patience, Performance, Civil Rights, and the Unfinished Project of Emancipation, I analyzed this long and brutal history of Black people being forced to wait for freedom, and I examined how these conditions of coerced waiting have strived to render the Black subject as, quote, one who waits, to cite Black anti-colonial theorist and psychiatrist Frantz Fanon. To do this work, I turned to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, a movement most commonly, as we all know, known for its insurgent demand for freedom now. As the civil rights movement unfolded, this thick tension between the violent demands of Black patients on the one hand and Black people's radical resistance to these demands on the other hand came to a boil, fueling a deadly battle to determine ultimately if Blackness and Black existence would be grounded in the violent procedures of Black patients or in the radical time of freedom now. Black patients or freedom now. By 1954, when the US Supreme Court offered a nod to outlawing racial segregation in public schools, the weaponization of Black patients had become one of the most powerful tools in the arsenal of anti-Black violence. As white supremacists scrambled to maintain a world that would remain grounded in the social, political, and financial economies of slavery and the unthinkability of Black citizenship, right? They wanted to render the idea of Black citizenship unthinkable, right? They turned to the slow time of patience to build and engineer a post-slavery mechanism that could delay, which is also to say to crush the possibility of Black freedom and full citizenship. On this front, we can consider a sobering example from white Mississippian and another Nobel Prize-winning author, William Faulkner. Faulkner was rattled by the court's 1954 Brown decision to integrate or desegregate public schools, and this instruction to carry out this ruling with all deliberate speed, right, which is the important part of the rule, all deliberate speed. Faulkner was so angered that he turned to the pages of Life magazine to issue a stark warning to Black Southerners in particular. As their demands for freedom now began to crescendo, right, they were emboldened by the court's ruling. Faulkner warned them, quote, to wait now, stop and consider first, he said. I would say to the NAACP and all the organizations who would compel immediate and unconditional integration, go slow now, stop now for a time, a moment. By responding to Black people's radical demands for freedom now with a really deceptive appeal to go slow and to wait, and we know exactly what go slow and wait mean, right? Faulkner used Black patients to stall and to hopefully annihilate Black people's political desires to become full citizens and to do so now. While it might be tempting to dismiss Faulkner's demands for Black patients as the violent rantings of a racist white Southerner who hails from, of all places, Mississippi, which is my home state, right? People love to scapegoat Mississippi. It would make sense that Faulkner would say this, right? I want to point out that Faulkner was not alone in this deep commitment to the racial project of Black patients. There are many others that we could talk about, right? But I want to go to one person in particular because this person was the President of the United States of America, Dwight Eisenhower, right, who, against the backdrop of the Cold War, really entered these debates about the relationship between race and time, and particularly surrounding Black patients. On the one hand, you have Eisenhower, who on October 4th, 1957, was rattled by the launch of Sputnik 1, right, the Soviet satellite, right, a technological feat that motivated Eisenhower to really lay the groundwork for what would become known as NASA, and to give it a hefty budget of millions and millions of dollars, right? Because of course the United States didn't want to lose to the Soviet. So outer space became this kind of new frontier where US empire saw a possibility to expand itself, right? And so there was, with the development of NASA and Eisenhower's kind of endorsement, this real commitment to speeding up the pace of social life and to also eliminating spatial barriers. So here we have Eisenhower and the nation put in hundreds of millions of dollars behind speeding up the pace of social life and also destroying spatial barriers. But the president brought a strikingly different time-space thinking to bear on the civil rights movement and Black people's similar efforts to eliminate spatial barriers and to acquire freedom now. At a July 17th, 1957 press conference, Eisenhower, who, as we just discussed, was otherwise a committed advocate of eliminating space-time barriers, really lamented, quote, I personally believe if you try to go too far, too fast in laws in this delicate field that has involved the emotions of so many millions of Americans, you're making a mistake. All right? If you try to go too far, too fast, you're making a mistake. Same Eisenhower who pumped money into NASA. Therefore, civil rights activists were working to eradicate the time-space barriers imposed by anti-blackness and white supremacy. And here I'm thinking of racial segregation, for example, right? Lunch counters and movie theaters, all of these spatial barriers. As they were trying to eliminate these spatial barriers, Eisenhower was busy trying to pump the brakes on these ambitions and was trying thereby to cordon off Black people from the national project of revolutionizing time and space in this post-war era of socio-political and technological transformation. In fact, the president's demands for Black people to wait or to be patient were routinely headlined in newspapers across the nations, as you can see here, with titles such as Eisenhower bids Negroes be patient about rights, and President urges patience in crisis, right? From the most powerful halls of US democracy. And I want to note quickly that Eisenhower is issuing these calls or coercing these calls for Black patients at the same time that the global pace of social life, right, is rapidly accelerating. This is when we have trains that can go faster. We have planes that can go faster. We have spaceships. We have financial technologies that move capital around the world more quickly, right, with the rise of globalization. So the pace of the world is literally speeding up. And here the president is asking Black people to slow down and be patient when it comes to their rights. And this aporia or this tension, I argue, right, is at the heart of what we call modern racial formation, right? As modernity speeds up, Black people are asked to slow down. So I contend that from writers like William Faulkner to US presidents like Dwight Eisenhower, white people have routinely insisted that Black people not, quote, go too far too fast. They have historically demanded that Black people, quote, wait and go slow. They have forced them to perform Black patience. Well, writing my first book, I watched, listened to, and studied this global symphony of demands for Black people to be patient. At the same time, though, and this is important, I was as attuned to the creative ways in which Black people were using their bodies to contest the violent operations of Black patients. Many of you, to be sure, are familiar with the now iconic photographic and televisual images of Black people in the civil rights movement using their bodies to resist calls for Black patients. The marches in the street, the sit-ins at the lunch counter, the speeches at churches, the singing at courthouses, the jail-ins at jails and prisons across the country, all of these embodied performance, these embodied acts of civil rights protests congealed to offer a defiant and resounding hell no to white supremacist demands for Black patients and to cultivate a political ethos that energized Black people's insurgent demands for freedom now. Black theater, I argue in my book, was crucial to these embodied efforts. Though an understudied dimension of civil rights history and memory, Black theater was a vital front of the movement and a crucial form of Black political protest. I argue, in fact, that the civil rights movement was acted out on the theatrical stage with the same creativity, the same political ambition, and the same embodied skillfulness that were hallmarks of something like the sit-in or the march or the jail-in, right, that are routinely prioritized in civil rights history and memory. If the civil rights mantra freedom now is one of the most salient phrases of the movement's political vocabulary, Black theater was a critical site for this urgent and radical refusal to bow down to the demands of Black patients. Part 2 on theater and the civil rights movement. In 1963, as Black people celebrated the Emancipation Proclamation centennial, so 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, they routinely staged Lorraine Hansberry's classic play, A Raisin in the Sun, which I'm sure most of us know, which is also still, I think, perhaps the most popular play by a Black American playwright. Guided by Langston Hughes's prescient question, quote, what happens to a dream deferred? The play allowed centennial audiences to ponder America's deferral of their own Black freedom dreams, to recognize that in 1963, a century after the Emancipation Proclamation, Black people were still waiting for freedom. When the curtains close on A Raisin in the Sun, audiences find the Youngers, a Black working class family still waiting on a series of futures. So the daughter of the family wants to be a doctor, the son wants to be a business owner, the mom wants to purchase a new home in a better neighborhood. But by the end of these plays, none of these dreams are realized. sitting in their cramped, overpriced apartment, awaiting the arrival of movers who will help them transition to their new home. So we're told that they're going to get this new home, right? But we never actually see them move into it. They stand on what the family's son calls the edge of these futures, right? The edge of these futures, the idea of proximity to, but not quite capturing. But they never inhabit these futures before the play concludes. For instance, although the audience witnessed the youngers packing and preparing to move from their roach-infested apartment into a new home, into an integrated neighborhood, and in many ways an integrated nation, the materialization of this dream is left hanging in the balance. We never actually see that family move into that home. Therefore, even as white theater critics routinely and almost obsessively describe Hansberry's play as, quote, and they all called it triumphant, right? It nonetheless ends with the youngers trapped in the same deplorable segregated housing project that was a deep source and a constant reminder of their oppression. Like Black people in 1963 America, the youngers were left to wait for their freedom. They were forced to perform Black patience. Further, we are told throughout the play that Black families like the youngers who moved into segregated all-white neighborhoods were habitually bombed. Even if this particular Black future were to arrive then, the threat of Black death still loomed on the horizon. Right, and so interesting note about A Raisin in the Sun. They were scared of this play, and so the CIA, the FBI actually sent agents to surveil the play, and the agents actually decided, hey, it's not really a threat. And he wrote in his notes, it's essentially a play about Negro ambitions, right? And so they miss all the radical edge that the play contained. So I'm interested in these kinds of plays throughout my book by people like Lorraine Hansberry, of course, but also Langston Hughes, James Baldwin, and many others. But in the time I have remaining today, I want us to turn to a lesser known group of Black theater workers who, though not as widely known, also used theater to shape the civil rights movement and to challenge the racial project of Black patience. That is the Free Southern Theater, a vibrant grassroots theater that emerged, as fate would have it, from the storied geographies of William Faulkner's Mississippi, right from Faulkner soil. And I'm interested particularly in this theater because I do believe that the current political and social conditions that we're being subjected to will require nothing less than grassroots activism, right? And this is essentially what these people use art to do during the civil rights movement. So the theater was founded in 1963 as a cultural arm of the civil rights movement. As the theater's other counterparts were marching and sitting in and using their bodies in other ways, these people decided that we will use theater to intervene into the civil rights movement. And it is particularly notable that they decided to go to Mississippi. What they decided is that we actually want to go to the belly of Jim Crow oppression, because what they said is that if theater can work in Mississippi, theater can work anywhere. And Mississippi was a haunted place, right? So when Black actress Denise Nicholas, who was a Free Southern Theater actress, arrived in Mississippi, she said that she felt, quote, alone and scared. She felt that she had landed on another planet or stepped back in time. And we certainly know Nina Simone's Mississippi Goddamn, right? Everybody knows about Mississippi Goddamn. Malcolm X claimed also in a similar register that the United States should get Mississippi straight out before we worry about the Congo. He later said that Mississippi is anywhere south of the Canadian border. And so you see the fraught political context in which this theater is entering during the civil rights movement by deciding to go to Mississippi. So like many college students during this era, Free Southern Theater actors decided to go on this journey into the belly of the Jim Crow South. But they added a new weapon to the civil rights movement, and that was Black theater. So they decided to write a prospectus that would outline the goals of the movement. And what they say in that prospectus is that they believe that theater would, quote, open a new area of protest and add a necessary dimension to the current civil rights movement through its unique means as a value of education, or its unique value as a means of education. And a part of what they believe is that in Mississippi and other Deep South states, education was often censored. Many Black students, of course, didn't have access to textbooks, and many of those who did have access to textbooks certainly weren't taught certain histories. Those histories were censored. Also, there were routinely blackouts on television for those Black people who had access to television sets. There were routinely blackouts that would prevent Black people from gaining access to certain knowledge. So they thought that by bringing this radical theater to Black Southern audiences, it could open up their consciousness and thereby cultivate certain political possibilities and fuel the civil rights movement. So they saw theater itself both as a political tool, but also as an education tool in the Deep South. So they decided to establish the theater at Tougaloo College, which is a private, historically Black institution in my alma mater. And they decided to go with Tougaloo rather than a school like Jackson State, which was a public HBCU, because they thought that this private institution existed, quote, what they said, outside of the jurisdiction of the state legislature. And so they made this decision because they did not want the school to be penalized by the legislature for allowing this radical Black Southern theater on their campus. But although Tougaloo was private, there were several efforts by the Mississippi Lieutenant Governor, for example, to revoke the college's charter for its participation in the civil rights movement. So they decide to establish a theater at Tougaloo College, and they ultimately issue in 1964 a call for actors and dancers and singers and directors and designers and what they call angels, which they refer to as people with money. What was important about the Free Southern Theater's application for those who wanted to participate is that they were very clear about the dangers of performing in a radical Black theater in the US South. And they asked people on those applications, would someone be able to send you as much as $500 for bail in the event that you are arrested? Why would they ask that on a theater education? So while the theater was there, for example, one of the cases that many of us know that the FBI called Mississippi Burning transpired, right? Where 3 activists were murdered and buried in a dam in Neshoba County for their participation in the civil rights movement. But even with these threats, right, the theater refused to backpedal. They refused to be scared and sort of lean directly into using theater to advance the civil rights movement. So often when they performed in places like Macomb, Mississippi, not only did the police officers, sometimes over 20, what they call 20 helmeted police officers, come to surveil the plays, there were also members of the White Citizens Council there who would take note of who attended the performances so that they can implement certain economic reprisals, or if people were domestic workers, they could be fired by their white employers. So they were surveilled from every angle, but also there were moments such as in Macomb, Mississippi, where individuals actually threw bombs at the stage, right? They actually threw bombs at the stage. One Free Southern Theater actor whose name is Albert Murray noted in his journal, quote, "The bombings in Macomb yesterday filled me with rage, and I wish we were ready to play now. Macomb, I think, will be our first stop." He noted that the actors had to sleep under armed watch that evening. I also want to share a story from Beulah, Mississippi, where a group of Free Southern Theater actors are actually detained by the police and taken to the police station. So rather than being asked about the theater, what the police officers asked them were questions like, quote, "What are you doing down here, pretty boy? How is that black pussy? And how does it feel to screw a white woman?" After they finally released the group of actors at 2 a.m., the police called the Ku Klux Klan and told them that, quote, "2 nigger lovers and a nigger were loose, so pick them up for us." For 3 hours, the actors endured what they call abject terror. They were crawling along Mississippi's country roads. They were hiding in weeds and dodging the beams of the Ku Klux Klan's headlights, right? Ultimately, they were able to avoid harm. I want to pivot now to what was perhaps the Free Southern Theater's most popular play, which is Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. Now, this is an interesting selection because Samuel Beckett is a white French high modernist playwright, right? He's not a Black playwright. But his play has been used in radical political movements that range from kind of Serbia to Sarajevo to Japan, right? Japanese women were using the play to protest patriarchy. But also, most of us might remember after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, when Black New Orleanians actually used Samuel Beckett's play to critique how Black people were left to wait for the federal government in the wake of that natural disaster. But it was really the production of Waiting for Godot at Alcatraz prison in San Francisco that fueled this theater to decide on beginning their existence with Waiting for Godot, because they said that if that play could be understood at Alcatraz, it would, quote, readily be understood and welcomed in that larger prison called Mississippi. So essentially, what strikes audiences about Waiting for Godot, and I don't know how many of you all have read this play, but it's what we call an absurdist play. In many ways, it's about everything, but also about nothing. So there are two protagonists who are left waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting for someone named Godot. One of the protagonists, whose name is Estragon, says he should be here. Uh, the other protagonist said he didn't say for sure he'd come. Well, he'll come back tomorrow, and then the day after tomorrow, possibly, and so on. So what ends up happening is that these individuals are left waiting for someone who was promised to come, right? Someone who they believe will come, actually, but who has made no promises to come, right? So they're in this incessant, interminable cycle of waiting. So the Free Southern Theater's production of Waiting for Godot was well received by Black Southern audiences, right? And I want to go back to this picture here. There were articles produced, for example, by a New York Times journalist that says they were waiting for Godot in Mississippi too. People got the message. There were two slaves in this play, one slave in the play who has a rope around his neck. And one woman in the audience who simply referred to as Negro Lady says at a production, we're the ones who have the rope around our neck. What this play tells me is that it's time for us to remove the rope around our neck. And there were many comments along these lines. And I don't want to gas it and suggest that all Black Southerners, right? Many of these people had eighth grade educations. Many of them were sharecroppers. Not everyone was vibing with this play. So there were moments in the archive where some kids got up during the performance and walked out. There were other moments where kids were so bored that they made spitballs and threw them at the actors, right? So they don't want to create a monolith to suggest that these performances energize and radicalize all Black people. That wasn't the case. But it did affect enough of them, right? So that we can conclude that theater had a radical impact on Black people during the civil rights movement in the US South. And I want to give you this quote from someone many of us know, who is Mississippi civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer, who at a 1964 performance of Godot in Ruleville, Mississippi, right, stood up during intermission and declared, quote, "You can't sit around waiting. Ain't nobody gonna bring you nothing. You got to get up and fight for what you want. Some people are sitting around waiting for somebody to bring in freedom, just like these men, Vladimir and Estragon, talking about Beckett's protagonists, who are sitting here waiting for Godot." Later, Hamer cautioned the all-Black audience to, quote, "pay strict attention to the play because it's due to waiting that the Negro is as far behind as he is." Right. So, in other words, the theater's work to expose Black patience was working, and how wonderful for them to have somebody as iconic as Fannie Lou Hamer really distilling and translating their message to those Black people in our community in the Mississippi Delta. So I want to actually show you what the Free Southern Theater audiences looked like. Again, this was a grassroots organization, and they made clear that their theaters weren't going to be Broadway. There weren't going to be fancy buildings, right? This is a cotton field in the Mississippi Delta. They often didn't have lights, so all of their productions had to be done during the day. The productions also had to be done during the day because if the Ku Klux Klan got word of these productions at night, they feared retaliation and murder. So many of them happened, or most of them happened during the day. And what I'm really interested in is how these plays not only advance a political message, but they also repurpose those plantation geographies. In other words, if those cotton fields were the site of slavery's exploitation and extraction of Black people's labor for centuries, and if the kind of ethos of that labor exploitation continued under sharecropping, right? This was an attempt by Black people to use art to repurpose the meanings of that land, to imbue these Black geographies with new meanings and radical possibilities. And theater becomes a vector, a vehicle to help them achieve that work. So I want to close just by thinking about the contemporary implications of Black patience, and to point out that in this very moment, as we gather here today, and as I move toward closing this talk, Black people around the world are still waiting, right? We're waiting for the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, an act that would make our right to vote a little safer. We're waiting for clean water in the city of Jackson, Mississippi, my home, right? The second Blackest city in the nation behind Detroit. There's a Black woman who has to wait longer to get to work because of gentrification. There are Black people who have been criminalized who have to wait for quote unquote speedy and fair trials. There are Black people who have to wait longer than their counterparts for kidney transplants, for emergency room visits. And here I'm thinking, for example, about the University of Chicago, which closed its trauma center in the late 80s, which meant that many Black people living on the south side of Chicago had to take a 45-minute ambulance ride to Northwestern Hospital, right? And these are not just the gangsters and the drug dealers, right, that were cited as kind of justification for closing that trauma center. These are people's moms and grandmas and dads and uncles, right, who are dying because they have to wait for access to healthcare. Updated textbooks, right? Education funding. The list could go on and on and on. The Black people left on the roofs of those houses after Hurricane Katrina. What I'm suggesting, in other words, is that Black patience is not a racial project of bygone days. And as we've seen with the recent attack on DEI, which is also to say an assault on our very humanity, Black patience is right now. It remains a part of the fabric of this nation, the fabric of this world. So when we ask Black people to wait and to be patient, we need to understand those demands as part of a much longer continuum that has weaponized Black people's patience against them, putting it in the service of their own undoing. But I, like Dr. Okello and so many of you here, take comfort in the radical power of art and the power of Black art to call out and to combat the vicious and persistent devastations of anti-Blackness that, like a serpent, always finds a way to rear its head and to strike the most vulnerable among us. They can underfund our schools. They can ban the teaching of our art, but they cannot suppress or quell the historic ways that we continue to use Black aesthetics to insist on our aliveness. If they ban every Toni Morrison novel, we will turn, for instance, to Toni Morrison's work in the theater. Here, for example, here's a photo of Toni Morrison in a Shakespeare play at her alma mater, Howard University. And what they don't understand is that while for them, Shakespeare represents the epitome of white Western aesthetics, right? If we look at those plays, they actually contain the very boogeyman that anti-Blackness spins its wheels to suppress and to keep from public consciousness. They take up racism, they take up colonialism, they take up capitalism. In Shakespeare's work, we find forceful critiques of the political elite, of monarchs, of kings. We encounter cross-dressing and queerness, and the list goes on. My point is that you can never actually suppress or ban the abiding critique of power that is at the heart of art the world over. And because of this, I am confident that Black aliveness will continue to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fleming, for those profound words, profound insights. Very exciting work. Very exciting work. Thank you so much. We'll open it up to questions from the audience, things you all are thinking about. You can put them in the chat, but also Dr. Fleming is here, and you can come off mute and feel free to ask the question.
Well, I guess I'll start with the first question. One, thank you for this very informative talk. Like I've learned so much just in the time I've been here. So my name is Jessica Watts, and I'm actually a biomedical PhD student. And so I'm really trying to get more into like how we can kind of converge like STEM with also like history, because it all matters and it all connects. We see health disparities because of barriers to healthcare and things like that. So this has kind of been my own little journey as I'm wrapping up my PhD. But my question for you is, I'm wondering if you could speak more on the effect that assimilation has on Black patients. So Black arts, intellectualism, labor, and even like economics were integrated into a system that was built on the dehumanization of Blacks, but it was ultimately never reconditioned. And so I'm wondering how that can also play into how like all of these systems that were meant to oppress us, they have access to all facets of Black life, and how we also as a community kind of are complacent in that as well, because we're pushing for some things for assimilation, but we're also ultimately still seeing these disparities. I'm wondering if you can speak on how we as a people, but then also how the view of assimilation also kind of propagates this kind of patience that is ultimately harmful to us as well, even though we think that if we can fit into these systems and function in these systems, that it'll be better for us in the longer run.
Yeah, that's such a good question, Jessica. And first, let me start by saying, I always enjoy people from the sciences, and I love the idea behind Dr. Okello's lab, right, to think about Black study and the possibilities of Black study, because I think, in the ways that you all understand in the sciences, we don't quite understand in the humanities the importance of translational research, right? Research that is intended to actually solve social problems. I think we need to have those conversations within Black studies in particular to figure out how to do research that solves these social problems. And I appreciate scientists always for that model. Integration is a tricky trap. It's seductive, it's alluring. It gives you hope, right? And this is a part of the critique that I have in the book. So I really build on a concept called cruel optimism, which is a theory put forth by the late Lauren Belant, where she says that a part of the way in which U.S. democracy and structures of power, the way they work is that they keep us optimistic, but cruelly optimistic. They conjure and imbue us with these hopes for a better tomorrow that often don't come. Right. And this is particularly true for Black people. And white supremacy and anti-Blackness know that this is an effective political strategy, but Black people have often been seduced by it because the prospect of those dreams and those futures, of course, are better than the hellscapes that they're living in at the moment. So I want to honor and understand why we often find ourselves in the trap of cruel optimism. But what we know, and I love your turning us to systems, what we know about the system and when we study structural analysis is that the system actually makes room for optimistic moments, right? There's a reason why after slavery we have those few years during Reconstruction of having Black senators from Mississippi, for example, and then lynching and everything else that happens. There's a reason why we have the civil rights movement and then white liberals and others run away from it. There's a reason why we have affirmative action and then the retrenchment of it. There's a reason why we have Barack Obama and then everything else that comes after. So I think our job then is to help more people understand the structural nature of our oppression so that we can then attune ourselves to it and accept and then strategize around that rather than kind of leaning almost blindly into the optimism.
I'm seeing a question in the chat that asks, how does one disrupt patience in a world where it is still expected of Black communities?
I mean, sometimes, it's as bold as saying, no, I'm just not going to wait. I want it right now. But we know that we can't always do that, especially in the academy, where the professoriate and other parts of this enterprise does not always welcome people who look like us. So when you can't just say, I won't wait, I think we have to be strategic and we have to actually go back to those vernacular knowledges, those grassroots knowledges of our ancestors and the people who have come before us. I remember my grandmother, who's from Mississippi, she was a sharecropper. This is a woman who didn't take anything from anybody, but she was very calculated. And she would say things like, if I'm going to flip the world over, baby, they won't know until they're flipping. Or, she would say things like she grew up on a farm and they had hogs. And she sometimes the hogs would fight when there was food thrown in. And she would say sometimes the steel hog got the slop because the other ones had killed each other. So I think there's a way in which Black people can use patience radically. We saw that during the civil rights movement, right? Where those people who were willing to engage in a sit-in, they were being patient theoretically, but their patience was actually the refusal to wait. I'm going to sit at this lunch counter and wait because I won't wait anymore. The jail-in was very similar. So I think we have to balance those kind of strategic acts of patience with kind of more radical demands for our freedom right now.
Yeah.
And we also have to call ourselves out when we demand Black patience of ourselves because we don't want to offend the ruling dominant class.
Charles Mack, Phillips, I'm seeing your hand.
Howdy, y'all. Dr. Fleming, I just want to say again, thank you for this talk that you gave, and want to shout out a fellow HBCU alum, graduate of Morehouse College, currently a third-year PhD student at University of Michigan with a focus in mathematics education.
Very nice.
Thank you. So I kind of wanted to go back. You touched on a little bit about a different aspect or perspective on Black patients and how it can be weaponized, or how Black activists weaponize that Black patients. And I'm also thinking about the idea of wait, of delay, then deny, eventually deny. And it kind of made me think about physics and about inertia, and how acting upon the bodies of Black people in a way that slows our momentum. Hey, what's up, PV? Okay, Alcorn, I see you. Yeah, acting upon the bodies and on the will and on the mindset of Black people to slow our inertia in a way that eventually brings us to a halt. And when I say brings us to a halt, I mean in a way that has us give up and accept where we are, accept our circumstances, and our resistance and our resilience to that. Can you speak a little bit more about what are forces that push us towards our goals versus, you know, these forces, this act of waiting, this act of delaying, this act of denying, and what are forces that we can cultivate that push us in a way that continually has us in a progressive manner? Specifically countering the forces that you were speaking about in delay and deny. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good question, brother. And shout out and all the love to HBCU alum, also people who do important work on HBCUs. That's a really good question. And you know, I'll start by saying Black patience is often rewarded. There was a moment in the civil rights movement where not only John F. Kennedy, but also his brother Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General, said that okay, we've done good work. They have been surface level dedicated to the civil rights movement, and they asked for what they call a cooling off period. In other words, they wanted Black people to go somewhere and sit down for a little bit, right? But we know that it wasn't a little bit. They want them to just shut it down. And so what that means then is that when you give in to those demands, when you placate them, you get rewards like being invited to the White House or being appointed to the president's commission on this. So I want to honor just how seductive Black patience is, right? And people are human. And many times people need resources, and so they give into it. But what can we do? I think what we can, two things I'll say. One, we can realize how Black patients enacts what some theorists call slow violence on Black people, which is to say that this is not a violence that is spectacle. This is not the lynching. This is not the act of police brutality. It is literally a slow wearing out of the body, a slow wearing out of Black being. And I think about, for example, a lot of Black feminist activists who are professors, right, who are always fighting, or you know, queer fam, who are always fighting, right? Fighting for resources, fighting for access. And while it might not seem that, you know, that they're being murdered by anti-Blackness and white supremacy, because it's not a spectacle, the violence is slow. So we have to actually come up with healthy ways of being healthy for ourselves, right? I'm thinking about all those civil rights activists who are iconic and who made important changes. Many of them ended up with mental, you know, dealing with mental illnesses, post-traumatic disorders, right? Many of them, like Fannie Lou Hamer, who was beat, right, actually had physical ailments as a result of that. So we have to figure out how to take care of ourselves and guard against this slow violence. And the last thing I'll say is, one thing I argue in the book is that we have to lean into this moment of the now, the right now. Black studies can tend to be so occupied with the past, slavery and Jim Crowism, and also what kind of Black futures will we have. But if we know that the past is traumatic, and we know that these Black futures that we're imagining are likely not to come because that's how Black patience works, then we have to find out a way to say, how do we enjoy ourselves right now? Whether that's a family reunion or a line dance or a civil rights meeting or sex, whatever it is, right? We need to place more value on the moment of the right now.
Thank you for that, Dr. Fleming. Just a quick follow-up in that as well. I think, as you know, from a personal experience, to say that that is a mindset, that is a conscious decision that I have worked through over time to, ground myself in the now and the present when there's been times where I feel helpless, and what's transpired in our society in the past and in the present and what we're living through now, and reminding myself that I am not helpless, I am not powerless, I am in training, I am preparing for when my name is called, and I'll be able to stand up and contribute to the community that has served me. So I appreciate your words and reminding us about being present, being in the present mind, and being mindful of what we are doing now, and knowing that the work is worthy. And it's for that reason that we are always able to move forward. Again, going back to the inertia. So thank you.
Ashe. Yeah, absolutely.
Other questions that are surfacing?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and hop on camera. Hi, Dr. Fleming. Thank you so much. I truly enjoyed your presentation and just learning more about like the Free Southern Theater. So my name's Lauren White. I'm a second year doctoral student in higher education at Florida State University. I really wanted to, and it's a lofty question, so pick your brain just around the now, right? Thinking about anti-DEI and thinking about how people are exhausted, and you talked a lot about just like artivism, right? The art and activism, and how like that really speaks to the soul with the Free Southern Theater. So I was curious kind of what you see the role of artivism as now in the space that we are, and also even thinking about that in regards to like representation, right? So like when we think about Wicked and Cynthia Erivo, how that can also kind of speak to the space. So kind of twofold question, but specifically thinking about artivism in regards to anti-DEI.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Lauren. And I'll start with something my mom said that at the time was funny, but as I've thought about it, it's actually quite deep. But after this most recent election, she said, "Lord, Black people are going to get back to singing those 10-minute gospel songs." This time where the music itself, right, as art, was forged in the crucible of a kind of blatant anti-blackness. And that as we've imagined ourselves to be farther and farther away from it, the art itself doesn't contain that same kind of thirst necessarily as it did in the thick of it, right? So I say that to say that historically, Black art has been at its finest under those intense moments of anti-Black pressure. If we think back to the first election of our current president, right? There were shows like Queen Sugar, for example, and we could go on and on and on. And it wasn't just that we had more Black shows with Black directors and Black producers, but something as simple as how we light Black actors, right? Those kinds of innovations came to the fore precisely because we felt under such intense duress and anti-Black strife. So I think that Black art is its finest in these moments when those soldiers were coming back from World War I. This is a part of the reason the Harlem Renaissance is so great. They were being murdered in places like South Carolina when they got off those trains, right, with those military uniforms. So to Dr. Okello's kind of purpose with this Black Study Lab and thinking about creative praxis, I think it is the solution. And there are, places like NYU, Steinhardt, and other education schools. There's so much work, for example, I know being done with like theater therapy, important work, right? I'm interested, what if we actually take like something like theater therapy and actually take up the complex traumas that people of color and Black people face? What if we actually use it to deal with anti-Blackness? We call it out, right? How do we use the body in performance to confront, to name, to deal with anti-Blackness, to deal with anti-trans issues? I think that's what will be required of us in art in these next few years.
I love that. Thank you.
We're coming up on the edge of time, and I mean, there are several questions circulating for me, but I want to be a good steward of yours and in our audience. So I'll ask just this final question: what are you reading, and how can we continue to follow your work?
Yeah, so I'm not a big social media person, but I am on Facebook and IG and Twitter, JB Fleming 7. for most of those. I'm also at Washington University in St. Louis. You can always shoot me an email. What am I reading now? So I'm reading I'm writing a book about, I'm writing two books, one about outer space is kind of the next frontier of colonialism, but I'm also writing a book about Black nightlife. And I'm thinking through these kind of issues of Black joy and also how Black nightlife hasn't been outside of oppression. It's not been this space where we go to just have fun. So right now I've been reading a lot about Harlem rent parties and scholars who are writing about rent parties, like, oh, look at those Black people over there having fun up in Harlem, and never taking up the fact that they're having those parties because they can't pay the rent because they're being charged 4 times as much as people on the Lower East Side. So that's what I'm reading right now.
Beautiful, beautiful. This has been deeply insightful. Again, I've taken just a page of notes, and I'm excited to continue our conversation, but invite everyone here to continue the conversation with Dr. Fleming and his work. Thank you for offering us these beautiful insights and giving us an invitation, an opportunity to think about the now and how we can bring art to bear on this particular moment. So thank you so much. If you all could collectively help me thank Dr. Fleming for his time, for his insights. Again, we really appreciate you.
Thank you. And thank you for your work. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Again, there will be a recording of this particular webinar on our YouTube page shortly, and we look forward to following up at the next one. Thank you all. Keisha, I can share the YouTube page and the email, and so I'll send that to everyone. Perfect. Thank you for joining us.